After finishing his work in a city, a businessman called a taxi driver to take him to the airport. For 20 minutes, he sat in the back seat and didn't say a word. But finally, he leaned over and tapped the taxi driver on the shoulder to ask him a question. The driver screamed, lost control of the cab, nearly hit a bus, drove over the curb, and just stopped inches from going over a bridge. For a few moments, everything was silent in the cab, and then the still shaking driver said, "I'm so sorry. You scared me to death." The passenger apologized, and he said he didn't see how a simple tap on the shoulder could frighten a man so much. He said, "Well, it's really all my fault. Today is my first day driving a cab. For the past 40 years, I've been driving a hearse." After 40 years, the Israelites, they're on the brink of doing something new too. They're about to stop wandering in the desert and start a new life in the promised land. But first they had to cross the Jordan River. But that wasn't the hard part. That was the easy part. The hard part would be claiming the land on the other side. Like the Israelites, we all have obstacles in our paths. There's work to be done. There's battles to be fought. There's sometimes wars to be waged. We face these in our jobs. We face these in ministries. We face these in our relationships. And sometimes we face these battles and wars within us. So how do we face these things? We can do it like the Israelites did. Like them, by faith, we can move forward. And this is our central idea. By faith, we move forward. My first division are chapters 1 and 2, final words and spies. So Moses has died, but God's promises still live. So it's time for Joshua to go to work. But before he did, there were some things God wanted and knew that Joshua needed to hear from him. With so much to do and there was so much at stake, Joshua, the new leader, needed to be reminded by God that he was not going to be doing this alone. He promised Joshua 3 things in verses 3 and 5. And the first is he promised him the land. Don't you love in verse 3, God even uses the past tense, I have given the land to you. He's emphasizing the absolute certainty that this is going to happen by talking about it in the past tense before it even happens. So God promises to give him the land. He also promises to defeat Joshua's enemies. God assures him, no man shall stand against you. So God's basically saying in so many words, I, God, am going to tilt the battlefield so much in your favor that no matter what is thrown against you, you will be victorious. And finally, he promises him that he will be with Joshua. He promises his presence. This is the same thing that God promised Moses back at the burning bush when God called him to face Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of slavery. God was committing himself to be present with Joshua just as he had with Moses. Those three promises are accompanied by really one primary command with some attached modifiers, and the command is to obey the law. How? God tells him carefully with a healthy dose of strength and courage. And to what degree? He tells him to do it fully, do everything in it, not just the easy part, even the hard things. He's to do it carefully with strength and courage. He's to do it fully. But what's the secret? Meditate on it day and night. And the word meditate actually means to mutter. Say it to yourself, repeat it, recount it, keep it on your mind. And what's the consequence? God tells him it's prosperity and success. He will be victorious in what God has called him to do. With these assurances from God, Joshua assumes command and calls the people to get ready. They're moving out in 3 days to take possession of the land that God was giving them. So they would know what lie ahead. Joshua first sent out 2 spies to scout out the land and not only look at the land, but try to get a peek inside Jericho. Now, apparently, maybe the spies weren't that good because it doesn't take long for the king to become aware that they're there. He's looking for them. Or maybe they really were good spies, but God had a plan because he wanted to rescue Rahab. But whatever the result, we find a great salvation story, maybe one of the greatest ones in the Bible, of God rescuing Rahab from this. Rahab the prostitute saves the spies in exchange for her own safety. What did she recognize or come to know about God? There was one true God, and that God was the God of the Israelites. She said, the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. The stories of their release from Egypt and their routing of the Amorite kings brought reverent fear to her. Not only did these stories stir up fear, but it also stirred up a heart open to faith. And as a result, she felt a sense of need for mercy that only these two spies could satisfy for her through a bargain that she would make with them. There was enough faith in her to make her willing to risk her life in the moment in order to save her from what certainly lay ahead if she didn't receive protection from them. So she saves their lives, and they agreed to protect her and her family when Jericho was defeated. Years ago, when my oldest Jake was in elementary school, well, he still does this. He always forgets things, and he was doing it then, and he still does it today. But one day he left a nice jacket at church, and we realized it kind of late at night that it was still on the playground, and we didn't want to lose that jacket. So about 10 o'clock at night, Jake and I drive down to church to get the jacket. Well, to get to the playground, you have to go through a gate, down kind of a long passageway or a little corridor that's dimly lit. So when we got there, I parked the car and I said, well, go get your jacket. I'll just wait here. Remember, he's little, and he looked at the gate and he looked down the little passageway that was dimly lit. And he said, "You're not going with me?" Well, of course I was. I knew he needed my presence to calm his fears. And of course, Joshua needed God's presence to assure him. He needed God's presence along the way. God was going with Joshua. God knew Joshua needed to hear that. On the other side of the Jordan, there were trained armies living in fortified cities and people that vastly outnumbered them. Joshua couldn't do it alone, and neither can we. Fortunately, God makes this same promise to us as he did to Joshua. As we saw, Emmanuel, it means God is with us. We saw in our lesson from Matthew 28, Jesus says, "I'm with you always." He will never let us down. Jesus will never let us go. We are secure. Jesus and God, they're more committed to us than we are to him. Do you think about this truth? Do you consider the implications for your life? Do you thank God for it? This promise of his presence offers strength to our faith so that we don't have to be paralyzed by fear. We can be free from it. We can move our lives. We can move forward. By faith, we move forward. Chapters 3 and 4 are titled Wet Feet and Memorials. Finally, after a 40-year wait, it was now the morning before the Israelites would cross into the promised land. There must have been a mix of excitement, anticipation, and suspense in the air because a swollen river stood between them and the promised land. How many miracles had these Israelites seen with their own eyes, since Joshua and Caleb were some of the only ones left from those who had walked out of Egypt? Yes, they had heard stories over the years, but how many had actually seen it? And seeing it would be something else. I'm sure they knew God was going to do something, but what would that look like? And this would include Joshua on that day. As far as we know, as of that morning, God hadn't explained to him what he was going to do. But finally, God lays out his plan. The people would first sanctify themselves, which likely included bathing themselves, bathing their clothes, and abstaining from sexual relations. And then on the day of the crossing, the priest would go ahead, carrying the ark, with the people following at a safe distance. The ark leading them would be a visual reminder that God is and would be going before them in the conquest. And when the feet of the priest carrying the ark rested in the Jordan, the waters upriver would be cut off, allowing the Israelites to cross. And that's what happened. When the feet of the priest stepped into the swollen waters of the Jordan, the water piled up in a place called Adam, allowing the nation to pass over on what it says twice, dry ground. Before the priest stepped out and the ark and the waters of the Jordan once again were allowed to flow normally, there was one more thing to do. And that was to take stones out of the riverbed to construct a memorial so that future generations will remember what God had done. A stone was taken from the middle of the river where the priest stood by one representative from each tribe that would be used to construct that memorial. Years ago at one of the national mints, a party that was touring it were told by a guide, if you first dip your hands in water, a ladle of molten metal could be poured over your hand without hurting your hand. The guide asked the husband, there was a husband and wife there, that asked the husband, would you like to try? Perhaps you'd like to try it. And the husband drew back and said, no, thanks. I'll take your word for it. Then he looked at the wife and said, would you like to try? And she replied, certainly. She pulled up the sleeve of her blouse and put her hand in a bucket of water, and then she calmly held out her hand while the metal was poured over her hand. It's obvious that the husband's belief was at one level and hers was at a completely different one. The wife believed on a completely different level, one that was willing to take a risk. Joshua and his people were faced with a risk, and in the process, they needed her level of belief, the kind that steps out and acts. They needed to cross the dangerous, swollen Jordan River. 40 years earlier, God had opened the Red Sea so that the people could cross it. But this time, the priests were stepping into the water first and trusting that God would open the way for them. They had to get their feet wet and trust that God would honor their faith. Now, many of you are like me. We don't naturally enjoy taking risks. We don't gravitate towards that. We want the way open before us by God before we move. And often God graciously honors that. But we must remember that a risk is only a risk if God isn't with us. We need to step out and trust that God will confirm our faith at the appropriate time. If your way seems blocked by God today, yet God is on the move, maybe you need to step forward by faith. Be willing to get your feet wet and then wait and see how God responds. Be willing to step out by faith, by doing, by saying, by committing to what God has put on your heart, knowing that if he's called you to do that, he is going before you, that God is leading you. This is how we will grow your faith. This is how God will grow your knowledge of him. And this is how he advances his kingdom. When you and I step out in faith and we get our feet wet. When was the last time you did that? If he's prompting you, will you? By faith, we move forward. Chapter 5, I titled Circumcision and a Stranger. Now, can you imagine the shock of the Canaanite nations when they found out that God had dried up the river, allowing the Israelites to walk, just to walk across? Since the Jordan was flooded, Jericho and the rest of the Canaanite nations surely thought they had plenty of time to get ready. But then they wake up the next day and the Israelites and the whole nation are on the other side. The time was now up. The invaders were here. I'm sure Jericho had scouts watching them from the Canaanite side. And when they saw what God was doing for them, they must have lost their will to fight. Joshua tells us their hearts melted and there was no longer any spirit in them. Any hope or bravado that was left in them was now all gone. Once on the other side, it was time for Israel as a nation to renew their covenant with God through circumcision, something that hadn't been practiced since their forefathers came out of Egypt. Although others practiced circumcision, it wasn't their idea. It was something that was being practiced. Only they did it with this meaning. For them, it was performed as a reminder that their bodies belonged to God and were to be used for his purposes and not for sinful purposes. It was a symbol that they were God's possession, set apart to be his people, and they were in a covenant relationship with him. While they camped in Gilgal, God's people celebrated their first Passover in the Promised Land, and they commemorated their deliverance from Egypt and the passing of the angel of death during the original plague. Once the week of celebration was over, God's provision of manna also ended. So now God was providing them from the fruit of the land. This brings us to the end of chapter 5, where we find an unusual story. Once he came close to Jericho, Joshua sees someone he recognizes as a soldier with a drawn sword. Perhaps he could sense there was something different about this man. Some commentators believe this could have been the pre-incarnate Son of God. Whoever he was, when asked by Joshua whose side he fought on, he answered, "I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I've come." Whose side he was on was not the issue. In truth, he was on God's side. He was not there to take sides. He was there to take charge, and that's what would happen. He instructed Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place you are standing is holy." Before getting things underway, Joshua needed to get his heart right. It was time to stop and to worship before going to work. Last Christmas, Catherine and the boys gave me a Blackstone grill for Christmas. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a kind of an outdoor cast iron flat top grill. Anyone ever seen one? Okay. And one of the more popular things you can do on one of these outdoor grills is cook smash burgers. Y'all have had smash burgers? So when you cook one, you're basically smashing the burger in and you're searing one side of the meat. So it really goes fast. And y'all have listened to enough of my teachings. I watch YouTube. So I watched a lot of YouTube videos on how to do this. And everyone basically said the same thing, that you've got to prepare because the cook goes so fast or you'll get behind and you'll get in trouble. And they were right. You have to have everything ready, the meat portioned out. You have to have the buns ready to toast. You need to have the cheese unwrapped, because if you're cooking for a group, you're going to get caught in a bind. So this takes preparation. It takes preparation before. You have to slow down and think through what you're doing so everything's ready. In this, we see things slowing down and preparation happening in this chapter. The covenant is renewed by circumcision. We see the Passover is celebrated. And then we see this beautiful picture. In a personal way, God is coming to Joshua. He's bringing him to holy ground, and he's asking him to bow low and be still. As one commentator put it, Joshua needed to worship before warring. He needed to bow before battling. He needed to submit before serving. And this applies to us as well. Before stepping out and taking action, we need to be prepared, generally speaking, in some of the same ways. We need to consecrate ourselves. We need to set ourselves apart from God. We need to renew our commitment. We need to slow down and worship God. We need to prepare our faith. We need to prepare our hearts to serve and obey him. This gives us strength, and this reorients us so that we're heading in the right direction. We're heading where God is leading. Do you need to slow down and renew your commitment to God? Do you need to set yourself apart from any sin that has crept into your life? You need to discipline yourself to stop and worship. These actions lay the groundwork for faith that's ready to be used. By faith, we move forward. During training exercises, the lieutenant was driving down a muddy back road. He encountered another Jeep that was stuck in the mud, and in it was a red-faced colonel at the wheel. "Is your Jeep stuck, sir?" asked the lieutenant as he pulled alongside. "Nope," replied the colonel, coming over and handing him the keys. "Yours is." No one likes to be stuck anywhere. The word implies something negative. Stuck, a bad job, a bad marriage, bad traffic. Sometimes the word applies to our Christian life. We're stuck. It feels dead, like it's going nowhere. And I've been there at times through my life, and many, if not most of you, if you've been a believer for many years, you have too. These verses tell ways to get unstuck, how to advance, how to move forward. And let me point out 3 ways. And the first is obey his word, know it, and do it. And the second is to get your feet wet, to step out in faith where you believe God's calling you to participate. Obey his word, get your feet wet, and finally, prepare yourself. And I'm supposed to have my garage door service once a year. We're not supposed to prepare ourselves once a year to serve God. It's something we do daily, like we wash our hands. Prepare yourself regularly, daily, to serve God. When we do these things, our faith will grow deeper roots. We'll find what verse 1:8 refers to as good success and prosperity. And like Joshua and the Israelites, you will find yourself on the move behind a great and mighty God. Will you commit to obeying his word, especially where you're not today? Will you get your feet wet if you're realizing that they've gotten pretty dry? And will you slow down and invest time in your faith in order to grow it? Because it is by faith, it's by this faith that we move forward. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the gift of faith. We thank you for your love for us. I ask that you would bless the study of Joshua. I ask that you would bless this season in our lives as we remember the birth of your son. It's in your name we pray. Amen. You're dismissed.